Amnesty International is accusing the Trump administration of abusing its powers to crack down on people helping migrants at the southern border. The non-governmental human rights organization recently released a new report. It alleges that federal agencies unlawfully intimidated, threatened, and harassed those at the border, defending the human rights of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. It also says the government is using the justice system to discourage lawyers, journalists, and others from documenting the alleged human rights abuses. Well, this comes as lawmakers are expressing outrage over alleged unsanitary conditions and overcrowding at several migrant detention facilities across the country. I want to bring in Brian Griffey from Washington. He's a regional researcher and advisor at Amnesty International, and he joins us now. So Brian, I want to start with a statement from the America's director at Amnesty International, where she says, and I'm quoting here, the Trump administration's targeting of human rights defenders through discriminatory misuse of the criminal justice system sets it on a slippery slope toward authoritarianism, So those are pretty serious allegations. Can you sort of outline the abuses that the federal government is facing right now?
Sure. What we've seen and documented over the last year and a half is a concerted campaign by the Trump administration, specifically the Department of Homeland Security and to a certain extent the Department of Justice, to wage a politically motivated campaign of legal harassment against people defending the human rights of migrants and asylum seekers on the U.S. Mexico border. Now, what this means is that activists, lawyers, humanitarian volunteers, including a clergy member, have actually been swept up in kind of a criminal dragnet where the Department of Homeland Security has abused its authority to conduct searches and questioning at the U.S. Mexico border in order to target people based on their constitutionally protected views and speech. Namely, while the Trump administration has been in very high profile and in plain sight, waging a deliberate campaign of human rights violations against migrants and asylum seekers for the entire duration of its administration, now it's started to target those who are assisting them, including asylum seekers who are stranded in northern Mexico in cauldrons of violence in border cities due to the Trump administration's policies to unlawfully turn away refugees and not hear out their cases in the United States courts.
And Brian, there was 23 human rights defenders who were interviewed for this report. Beyond their testimony, what other evidence does Amnesty International have to support these claims of alleged misconduct?
Sure. Now, it's vital, of course, to have had testimony from a couple of dozen human rights defenders who have themselves faced these abuses. But take the government on its own word. The U.S. government told us what it was going to do, then it told us what it was doing, and then it did it, which was this exact campaign of applying human smuggling charges, criminal charges, inappropriately to constitutionally protected activities to support asylum seekers, whether that's humanitarian aid or providing legal assistance to people.
We're looking at some of the video right now, Brian, of the border there with Mexico. It's not just the U.S. that they're focused on, too. They're looking at other governments, including Mexico. What can you tell us about that?
So the Trump administration has acknowledged that it's working hand in hand with law enforcement authorities in Mexico in order to conduct this joint binational criminal investigation of human rights activists, lawyers, and journalists under spurious smuggling charges. Specifically, those charges are claiming that they are encouraging or inducing people to come to the United States in order to seek asylum. Of course, that's a legal right they have in the United States to come here. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals for the Western U.S. already struck down as unconstitutional the very provision that the government has said that it's applying in these instances, and now it looks like it's headed to the Supreme Court. But whereas normally, if a court strikes down a legal provision as unconstitutional, you would expect the government to stop applying it. In this case, the government has ramped up its application of those provisions, and the United States has called on Mexican authorities to similarly restrict the rights of even U.S. nationals when they go to Mexico to support these asylum seekers stuck on the border.
I want to specifically ask you about human smuggling at the border. The report says that international law defines human smuggling as this: restricted to individuals who assist others in crossing borders in order to gain a profit or other material gain. But the U.S. government has a much more broader definition. This is according to ICE. Human smuggling is defined as this: importation of people into the U.S. involving deliberate evasion of immigration laws. So what does this difference mean when you're sort of parsing these words, and how does it help when you're trying to defend these folks?
Well, this is exactly why the federal appellate court struck this down as unconstitutional, and it looks like it's headed to the Supreme Court, is that the definition that the U.S. is trying to apply to restrict constitutionally protected views and speech of lawyers, journalists, and others is claiming that if you give a ride to someone in Mexico who's stranded on the road and they're headed to the border, you could be prosecuted for human smuggling even if they never even crossed the border, just for helping them to get there. Likewise, if you leave water in the desert for thirsty people, if someone comes to your door and is thirsty and wants a sip of water, they're claiming that that incentivizes people to come to the United States, even if they don't have status to be there. What's most concerning, though, is that they're claiming that even people who are seeking asylum, who have a right to claim asylum at official ports of entry or when they cross irregularly, because they don't have a legal status in the U.S. already, that anyone supporting them in making an asylum claim could also be swept up in this criminal dragnet and prosecuted for the effort to help these people in need.
I know it can be so complicated, but does Amnesty International have any recommendations or proposals to try and correct these alleged abuses against migrants and human rights defenders?
Well, fundamentally, the most immediate thing that needs to happen is that the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice need to stop applying politically motivated criminal charges and investigations against these people simply for their constitutionally protected views and speech. And what that means in practice is that they need to abide by DHS's own internal policies, which already prohibit the selective enforcement of border and immigration law in order to target people based on that protected speech. Moreover, we're calling on Congress to open a public investigation and hearings on this matter in order to bring to light what has been a concerted campaign that's been occurring mostly in the cover of darkness. And ultimately, they need to refine and change these criminal provisions such that they exclude humanitarian action and constitutionally protected speech from the purview of what they claim can be constituting human smuggling under U.S. law, which is not in conformity with international standards to which the U.S. is party.
Brian Griffey, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.